computer. Okay, fantastic. All right, welcome everyone. This is exciting. This is our last class of this series that we can all thank Tessa for inspiring the series. And I think your original request, Tessa, I think was just to have more of like a history, maybe like a little bit of like a timeline, the history, the transmission of Torah, how, you know, the start to how it got to where we are today. And we took that to a really fun level to really just like dive into not just, so class number one, we really did do, we had all the timelines. And again, if anyone is missing any of the handouts and wants any of that, happy to share. But like we had all the different timelines on the more practical level and the story of like what happened at Mount Sinai and the transmission. And then we dug deeper with each class about what this concept of the divine and the human in Torah, like how God had a plan, so to speak, for how there's the divinity and the divine origin of Torah, but how it's also part of the human experience and part of the human, like that we're a part of it, that we're meant to be partners, right, with God in learning Torah and in understanding Torah and all of that. So, okay, so now we're up to the last class of this specific series, but just before I dive into that, I'm so curious. I would love to just hear from any of you, like in short, what your biggest takeaways are so far, or what really stood out to you from any of the classes, or anything like that. Just like what you've taken away, or what you've learned, or what's been like an aha moment, or just anything. So you can just unmute yourself and jump in and let me know.
This is Harriet. What I was just thinking about when you were talking was the Rebbe's has the three ways we should view the Torah that we've been given, as a gift, as an inheritance, and what was the third one? But it really made it important, you know, that it was given to us and we have to do something with it, and it's a gift. You know,
yeah.
That was really impressive.
I love that. Thank you. I like even forget some of the things we talked about. So this is also good to jog everyone's memory. All right. Anyone else want to share something?
I think for me, it's been just how powerful the women of our history are, and just the lessons that we can take from. It's actually given me a whole different perspective about women in Judaism. And I think I really needed to hear some of these things, some of these lessons, because I had this whole conversation with Rabbi Landa after the one of the videos recently that we were watching, and about how Chabad and women, where women fit in. And it's just really opened my eyes to the power and the leadership that women in Judaism have or can have, which I didn't see before. I didn't know that. So
yeah. Do you feel like that's from this specific series, or you're talking about all the women's classes that we did before this one?
No, this series. I mean, this series. Are you talking about the last four about the Torah?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No. It's okay. I was just curious if like you were continuing to see that specifically in this series, or you're referring to all the women that we did before this series.
Yeah, all the women that we did. But in terms of like the Torah series, I think it's also been a real wake-up call for me as to how much of a gift, kind of what Harriet just said, how much of a gift it is, and maybe even the responsibility of what it is to be Jewish, and how deep it goes and how far back it goes, and just how we can really use it in our everyday life, just how to be a good human being.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
My pleasure. I love this. we are gonna take a little bit of a break after this first Torah and tea, but I want to get, I love it. I love this time with all of you. Let me just help someone who's trying to get in really quick with the information. Hold on 1 second. And if anyone else wants to jump in, you can do that now too. Don't.
Can you hear me? No, I guess not.
No, I hear someone.
It's Marsha Naomi Berger. I don't know if I'm muted or not.
No, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, I really like what you said about how to, I don't know if the word is disagree or question a teacher. I find that really, really helpful. And you mentioned that you learned a lot about this. I'd love to have a program where you teach us more about that.
about the laws of derech eretz, of respect and human interaction. And
yeah, I think personally that would be really good for me because I do tend to be really direct, and so I'd like to learn more about that.
I have to tell you, the cutest thing is, this is not related to our class topic, but it's just so cute. So Hadassah has this book on, it's like a kid's book. So it's like a chapter book with little stories, but they're to teach lessons through the stories. And it's about the mitzvah of onas devarim, which is like hurting people with words, like how you could hurt people with words. Oh my gosh, this is being recorded. One day she's going to hear this. So anyway, she was like upset at me about something, and she was giving me the silent treatment. So she wasn't talking to me for a couple hours or whatever. And I was just, I think I made a comment to her, like, listen, you're allowed to be upset with me, but you can't ignore when I ask you a question and whatever. And then she comes out of her room. It was like a couple hours later, and she was like, okay, mommy, what can I do to help? It was Friday. It was this past Friday. She's like, what can I do to help get ready for Shabbat? And I was like, what happened? Like, you've been giving me the silent treatment. And she pulls out her book, and it had like, there was a story. And then at the end, it was talking about, and again, from the Torah, like, giving someone the silent treatment could often hurt more than what words can do, or something like that. And so she was basically showing me how she had just read this in the book and realized, like, I cannot give my mother the silent treatment. So I just think it's so, so fascinating that, exactly that. Like, we learn all the different rules and more than rules, it's guidelines. It's like our advice for life, right? On how to live and how to fulfill our mitzvot and whatever. And that all just came from this concept. So, yeah, anyways, tangent, we can always suggest more topics for future things, right? Because there's just so, as we see from even this class, how vast Torah is and how much it's like, right? Like, we've delved into women, so that's more of like the history thing. And now we're delving into Torah as in like the history, but also just this idea of all these different sources and what God like had in mind for Torah being transmitted to us as humanity, right? And then there's like the very, 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 very practical, like just laws, like how do I do this commandment of being careful with my speech, right? Like there's so many ways to learn Torah and to approach Torah and so many facets of it, and it's just all wonderful. All right, so before I just dive into today's, yes.
I'd just like to echo Naomi's request. That's something I would really enjoy too. And
okay.
Me also, because I tend to be blunt. That's why she and I get along.
I love it. So like, you're talking about like the actual like details of Jewish law regarding human interaction.
Yes.
Like that, those kinds of things. Love it. Great suggestion.
Yeah, I love, Adina, I love the way you responded to your daughter, that you're allowing her to have her feelings, but how she behaves towards you, there are certain expectations.
Yeah. Yeah. And then anyways, so for me, it was more, I was just loved how she, we were both telling her, me and my husband, we said afterwards, like, it's so beautiful. Like, she's not just reading a book, but she's taking it to heart. And she sees like, oh, whoops, probably this isn't a good idea. And so that part really like touched our hearts, that she would really took it to heart instead of just like, okay, I'm reading a book, right? Because that's another thing. We can learn Torah like and this is what the Greeks actually wanted in the Hanukkah story. We can learn Torah like it's like a fascinating subject, right? Like it's just another, and people do that in college courses, right? Where it's just like another course on their curriculum. Like, oh, I'm doing Jewish studies, like, right? I'm learning biography and I don't whatever, like geography and this and that and all the different like, topics out there, and like, oh, and then there's Jewish studies. And sometimes we could all fall into that like trap, so to speak, of learning Torah in a way of like, what an interesting subject matter versus like, this is actually our curriculum for life. Like, this is, how does this relate to me, and how is this going to change my day-to-day thoughts or feelings or actions or behavior or interactions or all of that. So that part, I really like that, she's reading this chapter book, but it's based on a mitzvah in Torah, and it was giving her lessons, and she took that to heart. Okay, so I am now going to share my screen with everyone, and do you have to look at me? Okay, hold on one second, everyone. Okay, I'm sharing my screen, but I just need to take care of one more thing. Participants. One moment. Sorry, everybody. Thank you, everyone. Sorry about that. I'm actually in San Diego right now, and by my parents, and my mother wanted to figure out how to join. She's having technical trouble, so I had to just share that with her. Okay. So, so this is the last in this topic of the divine and the human in Torah. And I'm just going to, let's see. Okay, so part number one. So we have in the written Torah, right, there's the 5 books of Moses. And the book of, let me just look at this chat for a second. So we have the 5 books of Moses. So there's the first 4 books, and then there's the last book, which is Deuteronomy. So the Talmud and the Zohar differentiate between the first 4 books of the Torah and the 5th book, okay? So yes, we have 5 books, but there's a difference between the first 4 and the 5th one, which we are, okay, so in text number 1, the Talmud. So the Talmud tells us, the first 4 were transmitted by Moses from the mouth of the Almighty, whereas the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, was spoken by Moses from his own mouth. So the last book is actually, let's see here. The last book is actually, someone here, okay. The last book is, I apologize, I'm trying to let someone in. I think it's my mother. I don't see her in the waiting room. Okay. The last book is what Moses said to the Jewish people on his deathbed, so to speak. It's like him reviewing the Torah and giving them all the information that they would need as he passes on, okay? So what the Talmud is telling us here is that the first 4 books were transmitted exactly from Moses, okay? And the last one was spoken by Moses from his own mouth. So what does that mean? Like in the first 4 books, a lot of them, the Torah is written in third person, right? God spoke to Moses saying. Whereas in the last book, the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, Moses speaks in first person, right? So he says like, at that time, God said to me. So it's like, it's Moshe speaking in first person and to the Jewish people. Yet, what do we know, right? The last book is part of the written Torah. It's part of the 5 books of Moses, which means every word and every letter in the 5 books of Moses is 100% of divine origin. So what does this mean? Like, why is there, the commentaries really speak about what is the difference in this divine communication, that in Devarim, it's processed through the mind and speech of Moshe, yet these words and letters are the unadulterated word of God. Like, what does that mean? What does that look like? Okay, so in text number 2, in the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, really expounds on this, and he talks about how this was possible due to the degree of bittul. Bittul is, I think we've done this before, right? Like the way we usually translate it is like self-nullification, but it is, that sounds like a negative thing. Bittul is like the highest degree of humility. It's almost like I don't exist, right? Or like I only exist to serve my creator. Like there's no I in it, actually. It's not even I don't exist. Like the sentence doesn't start with I. That's what bittul is. Like you're just so given over to that thing. And so Moses was, right, as we know, he's the most humble human on the face of the earth. There's a phrase for that, right? And he had such a high degree of bittul that he was completely given over to the divine will, to the point where Shechina, this is also from the Talmud, Shechina medaberet mitoch grono shel Moshe. The divine presence spoke from his throat. Moses' own words were just God's own words, right? So kind of like the example that I've given before of a PVC pipe, right? Like there's a difference if you have a strainer and some things are coming through the strainer and some things are staying in, or a colander or something like that, right? You're holding something here and some stuff comes through, versus like a pipe where literally what you put in the top of the pipe or is going to come out through the bottom, right? So that's like what Moses is. He was like the container for God's words, but not like, and I'm filtering in my own opinions through here, or I'm filtering in my own personality through here, or any of that. Okay. So from a talk of the Rebbe, let's see if does someone else want to read that over there? Andrea, do you want to read for us?
This one, thus says the Rebbe, the book
Yes.
of Deuteronomy.
Yeah, that one.
The book of Deuteronomy acts as a bridge between the written Torah and the oral Torah. In the first 4 books of the written Torah, the divine element dominates, in that its every aspect, from the core principle to the specific formulation of the words, is manifestly divine. Here, the human contribution is limited to the fact that a human soul and mind served as the channel through which the communication passed, essentially unchanged. In the oral Torah, the reverse is the case. The human contribution is most pronounced, while the divine aspect is manifested primarily in the concepts and principles which drive the human intellect's arguments and formulations. But in the book of Deuteronomy, both the divine and the human aspects of Torah attain full expression, each without obscuring the other. The divine idea is processed by the mind of Moses, so that it emerges as Moses' own words. Yet as Moses' identification with the divine wisdom and will, that his own words are completely in harmony with their divine essence, so much so that they are no less God's words than the words which God dictated in the first 4 books. Continue?
Okay. Sure.
The Rebbe concludes, based on all of the above, we can say that the reason that this is necessary, that within the written Torah there should be such a phenomena, i.e., that the revelation of the divine word should come about in such a way that they were first processed in the mind and intellect of Moses, is because this is the foundation and precedent of the phenomena of the oral Torah.
Okay. So kind of what we're seeing here is this concept, or this idea that, right, we have the 5 books of Moses, which is like 100% fully just the word of God, right? And then God wants also that there's the written Torah and the oral Torah, that there's the human contribution and the human addition, right, into like this whole living organism, which is God's wisdom and will. And so in the oral Torah, we see that much more clearly, right? It's like this person said, and this, or like it seems much more of human construct, even though, as we learned before, everything was given at Mount Sinai, and this is all passed down, and it's still godly origin. But if you look at it just from the outside in, right, you see the divinity much more clearly in the 5 books, and you see the human part much more clearly in the oral Torah. And so the book of Devarim is almost like this bridge in between, right? It's this like, it's the proof within the written Torah that there's room for, that there's a place for the human element put in to Torah. Okay? Is that clear? If anyone has any questions on that, please let me know. And so right, so we have on the one hand, there's the oral Torah that is kind of like revealed by the Jewish people through their Torah study, right? And obviously there's a process, and we said there's specific rules. It doesn't just mean like anyone can come up with anything, right? And the entire purpose of learning Torah is to reveal what God's desire is in this world and what God wants in this world. But it's not about human logic. It is about divinity. It is about the divine will. And so therefore, right, if Torah is divine wisdom and will, but at the same time, God wants it given over and revealed to us through our own efforts, through our own study, through our own understanding. He wants that rooted into this idea of our own will and wisdom. Okay. But so since everything in Torah is rooted in the written Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, this is like that precedent for it. The book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, is like that precedent to show how the human contribution, so to speak. And then it extends from there into the oral Torah. Okay. Now, part number 2. So Yisro, here in English it's Jethro, but I'm going to say Yisro.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I have a question to go back to part number 1.
Yeah.
So when Moses is on Mount Sinai, does he only comes down with the tablets. So he has received the other books orally, and then he writes them when he gets down?
He wrote them word for word. Yeah, like God.
When he gets down or when he's on the mountain?
I'm pretty sure when he was on the mountain, but I can double check on that.
So he does the first 4, but does he do Deuteronomy when he gets down? Because why wouldn't, I mean, if it's not.
Right, I see the.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I can't even put it into words. It's such an abstract concept.
Yeah.
That God gave him the first 4 books on Mount Sinai. That from God's mouth, and that, it sounds funny, from God's mouth, and that what Moses writes down. So how is that any different than the book of Deuteronomy?
Right. So the bigger question here, I think, is like, at what point was the book of Deuteronomy written down? Was it like written down with the first 4, and
Right.
but like transmitted to the Jewish people as Moses's like, you know, like last parting words, and then given to them in written form? Or was it actually only written down later, even if it's originally part of God's first 5 books, so to speak?
Right.
Right? So it's almost like a timeline thing. That's a great question.
I think in the conservative thought is that, and Ria or Barbara have, or whoever else practices conservative Judaism, I think there's a thought that the book of Deuteronomy does come later.
Right. And I think so too. I just don't know. And so I don't want to like answer and say the wrong thing. I want to like be precise. So what I'll do is I'll email everyone. Any answers that I don't know, I'm going to email out the answer to that. So like, when was Devarim written and then also revealed or given to the Jewish people, right?
Super. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, so we have this. So Yisro is Moshe's father-in-law, okay? Now, we're going to just take what we just discussed and take it a step further, where the Rebbe shows that the process of the oral Torah, the process in which, right, the manner in which the laws and the principles were revealed to Moses at Sinai, right, and they're applied to everyday life situations by the sages of each generation, but this has a precedent in the written Torah, okay? And what's fascinating here is, and you can see this in text number 3 in Shemot Rabbah, right? Why was he called Yisro? That was Moshe's father-in-law's name, and the name means, like, Yeser means to add. So it means like an addition. That's what his own name means, because he added a chapter to the Torah. And what chapter are we talking about? The chapter where he comes to Moses. We're going to go into that in detail. For anyone who's not familiar, you shall discern from all the people. In other words, the way the Rebbe understands this, right, this idea of this chapter of Torah was an addition. Yisro came, Moshe's father-in-law came, and because of what he said to Moses, and I'm going to go into the full story, he added an entire part of Torah. Now, what we have to understand from that is that Torah is 100% complete without this section, right? When you say that something was added, it means like it was fine how it was, and then you added something onto it, right? But that's like on the one hand. And on the other hand, it also implies that because that whatever was added, that now becomes an integral part of it, right? So now because this part was added because of Yisro's initiative, this section became added to Torah. So it's like this interesting duality over here where it's like on the one hand, to understand that Torah is 100% complete, right? We don't need to add anything to Torah. But on the other hand, he almost like merited, because of what happened here, that this now is part of Torah because of what he added here. And I'm not going to, this next paragraph you could read on your own, but there's other precedents of like that in Torah. For example, if anyone's familiar with Pesach Sheni, okay, it's this idea of having a second Passover. What happened was there were Jewish people that, right, when it came to celebrating the first Passover celebration and they were going to eat the Karban Pesach, they actually had a sacrificial lamb and the whole thing. If you were impure, like if you had come in contact with a dead body, then you couldn't eat from the paschal lamb. You couldn't have any Karban, any sacrifice until you were purified. In other words, when it came to the first Passover, there were Jews that couldn't partake in the mitzvah because they weren't purified yet. And they came and they complained to Moses, who then spoke to God on their behalf, saying, like, why should we miss out on this mitzvah? Like, we want to have a second chance. And because they said that, and this is a whole other topic and it's a whole lesson, but I just want to bring out a point from here. They were given a second chance, but a month later, they could, they went through the purification process and they could like almost have like a second chance at doing this mitzvah. Nowadays, the way we celebrate that is a month after Passover. So on the 15th of Iyar, or the night of the 14th of Iyar, a full month later, we eat some matzah to remember and it's much more about the message of what this means, is that like it's never too late. We always have second chances, and we learn this, from this concept where the Jewish people were like, we don't want to miss out on this mitzvah. But anyhow, so there's laws there that came out of that story, but because of the story that took place, right? So it's like, what if that didn't happen? Would that law be part of this idea that you can have a second chance to make up the Paschal lamb or whatever? Would that have been part of Torah? Or recently in the Torah portion, right, where we had Selefchad, who had only daughters, and when it came to separating the land, women didn't get a portion of the land because they were included in their father's portion and then in their husband's portion. But there was daughters, women that didn't. They're like, well, there's only us and our father, right? Like, who's going to inherit the land? And because of their, and I'm saying the story like very in brief, but because of what they said, it became like the setting the precedent, so to speak, how women could inherit the land, right? Like in these scenarios, then it goes to the daughters if there's no, right? So anyway, the point here is like, we're saying, well, if these laws or mitzvah only came about because of the circumstance, right? Like, so the way I want to explain it is like they would have, the commentaries teach us that these mitzvah would have been part of Torah if not for these stories. Like it still would have been the law because they are godly. They are what God had in mind to begin with. But it comes about, we learn about it with the story of like Selefchad's daughters or the Jewish people that were impure and asked for a second chance, because then it gives them the merit that we learn about these laws through their merit. Like they had a part in this being part of Torah. Okay, so the idea here again is not that they're, and again, we're going to take this back to Yisro, right? Like, so are people adding to Torah in the written Torah? Like, is it because they did this, therefore we now have this new law, or is it divine origin to begin with always? And that's the answer. It is divine origin to begin with always, but they get almost like it gets attributed to them. They get some piece in it that they had a part in these new laws that we're getting because of the stories that happened. So taking it back to Yisro, which is Moshe's father-in-law, what was Yisro's addition to the Torah? And so here is that story for anyone who isn't familiar with it. Let's see. Rita, do you want to read that for us?
What was Jethro's addition to the Torah? The 18th chapter of the book of Exodus describes the arrival of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, in the Israelite camp at the foot of Mount Sinai. It then relates, it was in the morning, and Moses sat to adjudicate for the people, and the people stood upon Moses from the morning to the evening. The father-in-law of Moses saw that all he was doing for the people. And he said, what is this thing you are doing for the people? Why are you sitting by yourself, and all the people are standing upon you from morning to evening? Moses said to his father-in-law, because the poor come to me to seek God. When they have a matter, they come to me, and I adjudicate between a man and his fellow, and I make known the statutes of God and his teachings. The father-in-law of Moses said to him, it is not good, this thing you are doing. Whither shall you wither? Also this people who are with you. For the thing is weightier than you. You will not be able to do it alone. Now hear my voice. I will advise you, and God will be with you. You be for the people opposite God, and you shall bring the matters to God. You shall enjoin them regarding the statutes and the teachings, and make them know the way in which they shall go, and the deeds which they shall do. You shall discern from all the people able men, those who fear God, men of truth, who will bore profit. You shall set over them as captains of thousands, captains of hundreds, captains of fifties, and captains of tens. They shall adjudicate for the people at all times, and it shall be that the great numbers they shall bring to you, and the minor things they shall arbitrate themselves. It will be eased for you, and they will bear with you. If you do this thing, and God will instruct you, you'll be able to endure, and also this entire people shall come to their place in peace. Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law, and he did all what he said.
Okay, thank you. Right, so this is the, just like in short, the story where Yisro, this is after the giving of the Torah, right? So you can imagine, this is the first time the Jewish people are getting like 613 commandments, all the Torah, right? Now there's a million questions and there's so much to learn. And so Moses was literally on his own, sitting from morning till night with everything that any person that would come to him with any question, right? So like the lines were long and people had, I mean, we could talk something as simple as like a dispute between a neighbor, like, right? What's the law? Like now all of a sudden there's like this whole thing here. Like what happens if like, you know, my cherry, I don't know, this didn't happen in the desert, so it's not a real scenario, but like my cherry tree is like half over into my neighbor's thing and the cherries fall and they take the cherries. Does it belong to them or to me? It's falling into their yard, but it's my tree, right? Like that's not a real scenario, but right, like they're all coming to Moses and he's the one like from morning to night because he's the one that actually knows exactly every single law, every single detail because God had just taught it all to him, right? So along comes his father-in-law and was like, this is not sustainable, right? You cannot do this. And was really like told Moses, you need to set up a system, right? Where it's like you teach 10 people, right? Everything. And then those 10 people can advise the next 50 people and the next 50 people can write the next. And so if someone has a question, they'll go to like the lowest tier, right? The first, they have like 100 judges, right? And if one of those people don't know, then they go to the next tier, to the next tier, to the next tier. And you're just the last, you know, person who like, if really someone was like, wait, I don't understand what to do here, then they can come to Moses. So that's like in very short, the system that Yisro kind of put into place. So just to dig into this a little bit more, did Moses have a misjudgment here? Like, was it like Moses thought, oh, I can for sure do this. I have, you know, the ability and the capacity and all of that. And Yisro comes along and realized, oh, like this was a misjudgment on Moses' part and this is a problem, right? Like he's like, he just understands that Moses has an insufficiency of time and stamina to really be the person. So he has a technical solution, right? Let's do this hierarchy. Right? So, but if that was the case, then it wouldn't be considered an addition to Torah, because an addition to Torah, like we said before, there was no lack or deficiency in Torah prior to this addition. So if it was like there was a mistake here, Moses made a mistake and Yisro came and corrected him, then it means that there was a deficiency in how Torah was going to go until Yisro came along and fixed that. But that's not the case, right? We said it was an addition to Torah. Everything was perfectly fine until then, and yet Yisro created an addition. So what does that mean? What does that look like? Really, what happens is, and this was very similar to, I don't know if you remember, in a previous class where we spoke about by the giving of the Torah, right? The first two commandments were heard directly, God to the Jewish people. Every single physical human that was there and every single soul, which is all of us, because all of our souls were there, actually heard God speak for the first two commandments. Oh my gosh, Andrea. Just saw. So cute. I love it. There's a, oh my gosh,
I'm
I totally
babysitting.
You're babysitting. I love it. You know, it's so good for babies to be around Torah.
And so Ezra's learning Torah.
Ezra's learning Torah. I love it.
In his sleep.
In his sleep.
Adina,
yeah.
I have a question. If Moses was like completely like bittul,
yeah.
like the whole what that means, enlightened, you know, and completely humble, was it not that wouldn't have been him thinking me, I'm going to take on everyone? Was it not just I visualize Moses as just being like, I'm going to serve and serve until I can't serve anymore, and this is what I'm here to do. This is what God wants of me. So it's almost like I don't even, in my human mind and my limited way of thinking, it's like he wasn't trying to take it all on. It was just like he was doing as
100%.
much as he could.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. That's what we're going to see. That's exactly why. Like it couldn't have been that, right? Yeah. So that's exactly what we're going to see. So actually very similar. So the same thing, just, and this also shows, right, Moses' level of bittul. The Jewish people came to him by Mount Sinai and were like, we can't handle this. We want to hear it from you. And Moses was like, no, you need to hear this from God. Like, this is godly, right? Like Moses wanted that God would just give it all over to the Jewish people. He didn't want to be the in-between. Whose argument won out, so to speak? The Jewish people. God said, no, they're right. Right? And this is again, like the planting of seeds of this idea that God wants the human element in Torah, right? It's not just like this, anyway, so that same dynamic happened there where it was like Moses was thinking they should come directly from divinity, and God said, no, they're right. There's like a human element here where like they're going to hear it through Moses. So now, similar, except a different dynamic a little bit here, this is what happened over here. So Moses' behavior before Yisro came and gave his advice, right, is very valid and even ideal, right? The approach to the application of Torah to the problems of daily life, right? But Yisro he introduced a different approach, which was ultimately accepted by Moses and by God and incorporated as a chapter of the written Torah. Okay, so like in this paragraph over here, right, it's talking about that same similarity in that dialogue, right? It's just with a different aspect. By Mount Sinai, the debate between Moses and the people was regarding the dynamics of the communication of the Torah from God to man, right? Moses said, let the communication be 100% from God. And the people said, we want to hear the communication from God to Moses to us. Over here, the debate between Moses and Yisro was the dynamic of the application of Torah to everyday life. Okay, so what does that mean? At the core of these debates, right? So we know Moses was the most perfect human being. This is actually at the first class also, we read the 13 principles of faith for Maimonides. It's in the 7th principle that like Moses is not, he is a human being, but like way loftier than anyone we can ever imagine. The Torah tells us he was Ish Elokim, a man of God, like part man, part God, so to speak. Like in the sense that if there's a human being that could be as nullified to God as possible, it was Moses, right? But at the same time, every single soul possesses the potential for greatness. That's what a true leader is. Moses had the ability to reveal that potential within his people, right? A true leader turns their followers into leaders, right? And that was something that like even the Rebbe spoke about a lot. He said, in other groups of Hasidism or in other, like they want to hang on to their leaders' coattails. That's how the Rebbe would talk about it. Like kind of like, you lead the way for us, right? Like you show us holiness, you inspire us, you this. And the Rebbe was like, no, like that's not what I'm doing. You don't hang on to my coattails. Like the Rebbe was like, you all need to be leaders, and look what the Rebbe created, right? Sending people out worldwide to build their own communities and do their own thing. He's like, so in other words, a true leader doesn't inspire followers, they inspire leaders. And that's, so, and this is just a little bit of a diversion, but I thought this was nice and I wanted to add it in. But in Tanya, chapter 42 of Tanya, this is from there, it says, the Talmud says, in Brachot 33b, and now, Israel, what does God, your God, ask of you? Only to fear God, your God. And the Talmud says, is fear of God such a small thing? Like, that's all we're asked? Fear God. And the Talmud says, yes, for Moses, it is a small thing. So, like at face value, that doesn't really make sense, right? Oh, okay, for Moses, it's a small thing, but what about us, right? What does God ask of you, of every individual, not of Moses? We're not talking about Moses here, we're talking about us. So the explanation is as follows. Each and every soul of the house of Israel has within it an aspect of Moses, our teacher. Moses is referred to as the faithful shepherd, and he draws down and feeds the level of da'at, deep bonding knowledge, to the community of Israel to know the one God. So this concept is that a true Jewish leader, the true Jewish leader in every generation, they're not just a leader that inspires leaders, but they are actually a neshama klalit. This is a little Kabbalistic ready, but they are a general soul, and there's like a piece of their soul in everyone's soul. Okay, so there's a much more of like this soul connection where they are. It's like, again, this duality, because 100% Judaism does not believe that we need any intermediary between us and God, right? It's not like in some religions where it's like you go to the spiritual person and they're the line to God for you, right? Like we have every single one of us, we have our own direct line to God. At the same time, God gifted us with this concept of having Jewish leaders, and these Jewish leaders are powerful Jewish leaders in the sense that the opposite of the way we think of leadership. So today's leadership, I'm talking about like political, like anyone who's like in the typical, you know, very, very Jewish leadership and the world of leadership that we see today are like really polar opposites. Because again, a real leader is like, it's totally not about them. It's completely about like, I'm just here, like what Maddie was saying, I'm just here to serve. I'm just here to like do whatever I can to help you with your connection to God. And their neshama is like a general neshama soul to like comprise all the souls of the people that they lead, etc. So where were we going with this? Okay, so we're talking about Moses and this greatness of Moses, and he had this greatness, but he also has the ability to like transmit that and to like not even transmit that, realize the potential of the greatness in each of the individual souls of the people. So now the question is, so, you know, should Moses raise the people to his level, or should he lower himself and the Torah to theirs, right? Like which way is this supposed to go now? Do you want to read that for us, Harriet, this section?
So the question was, should Moses raise the people to his level, or should he lower himself and the Torah to theirs? As we have seen, the people demanded, and God agreed, that they should receive the divine revelation of the Torah on their own limited and flawed level, rather than on the elevated level to which Moses might raise them. So they received the entire Torah, with the exception of the all-inclusive first two commandments, as words emerging from the human mouth and pen of Moses, rather than as a transcendent voice from heaven.
Okay. So I think that's really interesting. Like what was the one that kind of won out, so to speak, and the one that God really wanted was, again, this idea of it coming through the human experience. Okay. So now, having received the laws and the principles of Torah through the agency of Moses, how were these to be implemented in their daily lives? Who would translate these laws and principles into guidance for raising a child, writing a troubled marriage, resolving a dispute between neighbors? And I think that just in that question to really like, and I think Maddie kind of touched upon this idea that Torah in its essence, it's like literally a guidebook for life. There is every single thing is in Torah, right? Relationship advice and parenting advice and human interaction, like it's all in there. At the same time, sometimes we don't have understanding or access to it enough, right? And it's like, again, this part where I'm like, God gave us all the tools we need, and still we have leaders, we have rabbis, we have mentors, we have, right? Like we have people that can help us unpack it and understand it. And it's a little bit of a tangent here, right? But I guess a lot of you know that I have like a passion for, I'm a life coach, and I have a passion for coaching and for self-help and all that stuff. And what's fascinating to me is like, I'm like, all of this is in Torah. Like, some things contradict Torah 100%, but some things are just like, I'm like, this is what Torah teaches us, but it's packaged differently, right? You can't, like, where can I get the book from the library that takes this like self-help concept, but does it all the way from a Torah perspective, right? Like 100% it could, but like, we don't have the library of just, you know, read this book and understand it this way or whatever it is. So, where was I going with this? So this idea that 100% it's all in Torah, like I don't think we have to go to any other philosophy or modality or whatever technically to get it, because it is all in Torah. But at the same time, God wants that human element, and a lot of times, like it's not, and it's like back to the black and white discussion, and it's so black and white in Torah, right? It's like I have my Torah concepts, and then how, like, right, and then like, who am I going to go to, or who can help me really understand the practical, what do I do here in this situation? What is my, you know, responsibility here? Or what is my role here? Or what is the way that I know that the choice I'm making is in line with what God wants and with the Torah value? Okay, so that is this question that we're kind of left with over here. Let's see. Who would like to read that for us? Rhea, do you want to read this section for us?
The obvious choice would be Moses. He received these laws and principles from God. His knowledge and understanding of them were absolute. His application of Torah is certain to be the most authentic rendition of the divine wisdom and will. It is true that Moses is definitely removed from the petty neighbor's dispute he is being troubled to resolve. But it's also true that the two litigants standing before him are certain to be elevated by the experience. In the presence of Moses, they too are capable of rising above the pettiness of their conflict. Under Moses' leadership and guidance, they too are capable of relating to the pure principle being expounded and of applying it to their relations back in their neighborhood. This was how Torah was taught and applied to the Israelite camp until Jethro came and challenged Moses' ideal approach. Jethro was an outsider, convert to Judaism, who was not even present at the revelation at Mount Sinai.
And then in these parentheses, it just talks about how we know that, like how it could be that, because Torah isn't in chronological order, and how he wasn't even there at the revelation. But I'll let you read that on your own if you so desire.
Do we have any idea where Jethro learned these business strategies? I mean,
tell me what you mean by that.
And the whole organizational chart, the way you divide up tasks and how you get things done in an efficient method. I mean, was he a shepherd?
Well, he was actually the king of Midian for
okay, right,
many years, and he was Paro's advisor.
Okay.
Right. So I think from that already, he was at a caliber of, he was
a leader.
He was smart. Yeah. He was smart. He wasn't a simple person. He was definitely a leader. He was a high advisor to Paro, and then he was a king in Midian. Okay. Does anyone want to keep reading over here? Naomi, do you want to keep reading from Moses saw the people of Israel?
Okay. I could get my chat screen out. Are we up to Jethro insisted?
Oh, do you see it on the screen or no?
Oh, where it says Moses saw
the people of Israel, that one.
Moses saw the people of Israel from the inside in the light of their highest potential, from the perspective of the inner core of their souls, as they are one with his own soul within the singular soul of Israel. Jethro saw them from the outside, their everyday selves, their petty cares and conflicts. He saw them as they are apart from Moses, while Moses saw them only as they are in their relationship with himself. Jethro insisted to Moses that the people of Israel had to learn to govern themselves, to arbitrate their own disputes, to apply the laws and principles of Torah to their own lives. Moses was to remain the sole source of these laws and principles, but their implementation was to be achieved by a multi-tiered body of magistrates and counselors at every level of the community, captains of tens, captains of 50s, etc., so that the divine law would permeate their lives on every level. This is what Jethro added to the Torah. Without his addition, the Torah was complete. Indeed, there was no real need for Jethro's system, as Moses could always be counted on to raise the lives of his people to the level on which he expounded the word of God. But their understanding and practice of Torah would have remained something that Moses had empowered them to attain, not something they had attained on their own. Jethro's system made the Torah the personal achievement of every individual mind and life.
Thank you. So I think that's really powerful. Also, kind of the idea I was talking about before, where it's like a leader could have make his followers reliant on him, right? Like, I'm going to teach you, and like the idea where the Rebbe said, you're not going to hang on to my coattails, right? Or it's kind of like the difference between teaching someone how to learn, teaching someone or teaching someone how to learn themselves, right? It's like you could teach someone, or you could, like the skills needed for someone to learn themselves. It's like let's say Chumash, you could teach someone Chumash, or you could teach someone Chumash skills so that they can learn the Chumash themselves, right? So here, that was kind of like the deeper ideological difference over here, where Moses, like 100%, Moses' idea was valid, and he could do that. He could raise all the people to his level. He could, lift them out of themselves, all of that. And the ideology of Yisro was more like, this needs to be something that they learn how to do, that they do on their own level, that they incorporate this divinity into every aspect of their mundane lives. And that, like, eventually, that was the way that it ended up going, and therefore this section was added to the Torah. So, yeah.
Excuse me. It's like the saying, you could feed a man or you could teach him how to fish.
Exactly. 100%. So that's exactly what it is. So what we're learning here, right, is that Yisro's initiative was accepted and implemented by Moses, and not only that, it was written into the Torah, right? So if not for Yisro, the Torah would have remained the Torah of Moses, right? A guide to life for Moses' elevated souls. But after Moses' passing, a system that, such as Yisro's, would have been established to bring Torah down, to bring down the Torah of Moses to lesser generations with lesser leaders, right? So, but Yisro achieved that Moses delegated of his own capacity to interpret the Torah to the stages of his generation, and by extension, the stages of all generations, because it was Moses who established the system. It was incorporated as a section in the Torah, making it an integral part of the divine communication to man. Okay, so again, I think it's just like really fascinating to see this like back and forth of the divinity, and then to like how we're bringing it down to us as our human experience. So we've already seen how in oral Torah, right, the deficiencies and shortcomings of the human state are not only incorporated and embraced, but enlisted to arrive at a deeper and truer understanding of the divine wisdom and will. And in this case, right, this case of Yisro's chapter that was added into the Torah, right, this feature of Torah is shown to be rooted in the written Torah, which is the ultimate source for all that constitutes Torah. So it's like the precedent in the written Torah for this aspect where God, like, again, I just keep coming to like God wanting Torah to be like this living organism, right? Not just like, I'm going to spell everything out black and white, make it clear as day, and then like done, right? It's like through generations, like how do we apply this now, and how does it work? And if we use these principles, and, in this case, specific scenario, and it's like this really like dynamic living organism. Okay.
Dina, I'm just having, again, my mind is just a little bit spinning with this.
Yeah.
God gave us Torah at Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
Everything was already in it.
Yes.
So when we say here that the section of Yitro was added, it really wasn't added because it was already foregone. God had already put it in the Torah.
Right.
Because nothing is added to Torah, I always thought. So I'm confused with this. How could it be that we say this portion of Yitro was added when we feel that God had it all at Mount Sinai before this happened? So
you're asking, like, on a very practical level, when was the written part of Yitro? Like, in other words, let's go with this. Right? We know that Torah preceded creation.
Right.
Right? It says that God looked into the Torah and created the world, because Torah is essentially God's brain, right? It's like God's wisdom and will. It's part of him. It's not a separate thing.
Right.
Right? So it's his wisdom and will.
Everything was given at Mount Sinai.
Everything was, yes, but not all in written form.
But you said, if I'm not misunderstanding it, that the words are God's.
Yeah.
So God knew what Yitro was going to say.
100%. Oh, I mean, God knows right? Like time.
Right. I mean, the all of that. I understand that, and I love that. But I don't but what I'm saying is, how can we say Yitro was added if it was already before the creation of the world? It was there. Right.
Okay, so that's why just to clarify your question, the question is more on like the very practical level. Like for example, tell me if you could understand this mentally. Everything that's in Torah existed, right? God has it. It's his. Yes. It's his wisdom and will. Now, at what part? But there's a story here. The story only took place later, right? So in other words, the part where Yisro comes to Moses, like that's, for God, there's not like, that doesn't happen in the future. That's not like, it's not a timeline. It's all known. Everything that's ever going to happen, God knows it, right?
Okay. Yes.
Okay. So the timeline, so it's in the Torah, right? It's in God's wisdom and will. It's already there that Yisro is going to come to Moses and say, Moses, do this thing, whatever. But the timeline of the story happening is it happens at this part in history, right? At this part, after the giving of the Torah, Moses is sitting and judging the people. So your question is, when was this, the written story of it given to the Jewish people?
Yes.
Because did they already have it? Were they like reading
Right.
the written and being like, look what's going to happen in 3 weeks from now, right?
Yes,
Like same with Devarim, like look what Moses is going to tell us at the end of his lifetime,
Right.
right? So like what was written, what was given to them written and when, and then like the parts that happened later, they, right? That's your question.
Yeah.
Okay, I love the question. How could you end this part? Or when did they? Okay.
I have an observation.
Yeah.
Observation here, which is that basically Yithro saw something evolving. When Moses first sat with the people and was arbitrating, there was like maybe a smaller group. And then as a larger and larger group came, and as Moses got older and older, Yithro saw that there was this possibility that without passing it on to more people, God's divine views of the Torah would somehow not be passed on. So Yithro, in my view, saw something and said to Moses, wait a second, there are too many people here. You need to educate more leaders, which is what God wanted anyway. It just wasn't spelled out, and now I see it. And oh, by the way, you're getting older, and at some point, the generations after you pass, the generations are going to need to understand the divine will of God. And so it's important that you pass it on, which is what God wanted. And so I'm giving you this idea because I can kind of see these other things that have now become clear that God knew all along before creation, but now are clear to us. I mean, that's my observation.
Yeah. So that's kind of like, that's exactly like the, you know, just on like the surface level, exactly like the practical dynamic of what was going on, exactly what you said, right? And then there's like the deeper, which is like the ideology, where Moses was like, if I, you know, like raising them up to this level where it's like, if I got this divine communication, I'm going to hand it to them as, you know, one-on-one as I could and raise them up and all of that, which is like one ideology versus like, no, we need to set this up kind of like, even if they're, you know, with layers, and let it be like so cemented into them as humans and not kind of like rely on a leader to be the one that, right? So it's like what you brought up is exactly like the surface, like the practical dynamic of it. And then what we're going deeper just to explore is like the way Moses was approaching it, which is 100% valid. But ultimately, Yisro came and like added this thing in, and because he did, and that ended up being accepted, and it teaches us a powerful lesson, that idea. Okay, so.
Adina.
Yes.
There's also the concept of our human mind is so limited that we can't actually understand it on our small capacity, versus the God and the universal wisdom and all that there is to know doesn't even see things in linear time. Like it's not even past, present, future to them. It's just all ever, like anything that's ever been and ever will be. It's this constant energy. And so to us, it has to make sense in a linear, this happened then and then this happened then. But if God already knew everything, then it wasn't seen like that at this time and that time. It was always going to be, because we human beings are the ones that created time.
Right.
So
it's very hard to to wrap our brains around this idea, because we see things in linear and in time and before and after and later and whatever. And then for God, like that doesn't exist. He's above time. Time is a creation of his. So yeah, it's a little hard for our brains sometimes. Okay, so part 3, plurality and unity in Torah. Okay, so again, we keep going into this duality over here, where Torah is on the one hand, a divine revelation and gift, and it's also the product of human study and understanding, right? So we have this duality, and right, so the duality of multiplicity and diversity on the one hand, and on the other hand, though, right, we even Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, God is one. Like there's so much about it being singular and about being, the unity of it, right? So as our comprehensive gift to a just, moral, and godly life, the Torah's function is to particularize and differentiate, right? We have to know the difference between right and wrong, between permissible and forbidden, between holy and mundane, right? We have to have all these categories. And again, within these categories, there's nuances and there's subcategories. Like I said, each mitzvah has its own curriculum underneath it. It's not just the words of the mitzvah. It's like, and then what? And then how? And then, right? There's so many distinctions. This is a Kabbalistic concept that Chassidus speaks about a lot, this idea of avodat habirurim, the work of refinement. I wonder if maybe the concept of tikkun olam is like very similar to that, but this idea where like, if I go really Kabbalistic, right, there was this concept of like shattering of the vessels, like God, the world couldn't like contain godliness. So there was, I'm going to just try to do this really quick because this is a bit of a tangent to get really Kabbalistic, but like godliness like shattered everywhere and it created sparks in everything. Okay. So like this cup right here has a godly spark in it. And how do I redeem that spark? How do I, like, if you think about godly sparks in prison, how do I redeem the spark in here is by using it for a mitzvah, right? So I'm going to make a blessing on my water and drink it and then use the energy from the drink to give a passionate Torah and tea class, right? Then I have redeemed the spark in the water and the spark in the cup, etc. So that's like this idea of avodat habirurim, like we need to refine all the sparks in the world. And actually, again, a little bit of a tangent, but the Jewish people were enslaved in Egypt. They came free, and Maimonides, right? There's a Jewish law now not to live, that a Jewish person should not live in Egypt and like permanently live in Egypt. And one of the reasons is like all the sparks there were refined. Like there's nothing for a Jew to accomplish in Egypt. Like we accomplished it from all those years of slavery and everything that happened there. Like all the sparks there are done. There's no more godly sparks there that we need to do anything with. So there's no reason for a Jew to live there. But anyway, so this is like this process of extracting sparks of divine potential that are everywhere in the world. And so it's the same thing with like the Torah, right? It has all these different parts, kind of like I was saying, there's so many different ways, right? We can have a class on history, we can have a class on narrative, on law, on ethics, on philosophy, on mysticism, all these parts. It's like Torah itself is made up of all these different parts. Okay, so text number 4, this is from Tehillim. One who toils in Torah. See, Tessa said maybe too much learning, no such thing. What is said of him? For only in the Torah of God is his desire, and in his Torah he utters day and night. He shall be as a tree. And the Zohar says, just as a tree has roots, and it has husks, and it has marrow, and it has branches, and it has leaves, and it has blooms, and it has fruits, so too the words of the Torah, they have the plain meaning of the verse, exegesis, allusions, hidden secrets, right? There's all these levels of learning Torah, right? There's the plain, simple, literal meaning, and then there's deeper and deeper and allusions and all this different stuff, right? Like there's Pshat, Pardes is an acronym for Pshat, which is the simple explanation, Remez, which is like hints, Drush, right? Like the Midrash, like expounding on it, and Sod, which is all the mystical explanations. And the sages teach there's 70 faces to the Torah. Every aspect of Torah has 600,000 meanings because there's corresponds to 600,000 souls of Israel, right? So there's all these different, this idea, and this, each law has 49 sides of purity and 49 sides of impurity. So in short, right, to really get from that is that Torah is very, very, very vast on the one hand, and on the other hand, Torah is the ultimate unifier. Okay, so text number 6 in Proverbs. The whole of Torah was given to make peace in the world, as it is written, its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its pathways are peace, right? We say that in our davening. We say that when we have the Torah out of the ark. Text number 7, an architect who builds a palace does not do so on his own. He has scrolls and notebooks which he consults how to place the rooms, where to set the doors. So it was with God. He looked into the Torah and created the world. So Torah is God's blueprint for the world, right? The architect, the blueprint for which God as the architect created the world on. And in text number 8, we experience our own personality, our everyday lives, and the world in which we live as a jumble of diverse forces, motivations, and entities, each with its own nature and character, each pursuing its own goals and strivings. Torah, as the divine blueprint for creation, brings unity to our fragmented self and world, assigning to each element, force, and phenomenon its role and purpose in the Creator's overall goal in creation. Okay, so this is like the other part where we're like, on the one hand, we have all of this plurality, but then we have this unifying part, okay? Text number 9. This is what the Torah and its commandments accomplish. They dissolve the veil and concealment of the natural reality, which presents a face of multiplicity and divisiveness, and transform the world from a multiplicious domain, a Rishus Harabim, into a singular domain, a Rishus Hayachid that reveals the divine unity, okay? So really Torah is, its essence is the idea of bringing this world that seems like it's made up of so many parts and seems like it has all these, that it's fragmented and divisive and all of that, that Torah actually brings it all together, right? We know that like one verse, one word, one letter, right? You can extract tons of laws. The oral Torah can extract tons of laws just from one little place, right? But then there's also the opposite where there's one mitzvah, right, which has thousands, hundreds and thousands, whatever, like all these different offshoots of it, right? Like what's the way that we keep this one mitzvah? So we have this plurality and unity in Torah. Okay, Mechilta. The Mechilta teaches, let's see, someone else's voice other than my own. Do you want to read that for us, Robin?
God spoke all 10 commandments as a single utterance, something that is impossible for a human being to articulate. As it is written, God spoke all these words to say. If so, what is the meaning of the verses, I am your God, I am God, your God, etc.? These come to teach us that God first spoke the 10 commandments as a single utterance, and then he came back to specify them, each as a separate utterance.
Mm-hmm. And then the Maharsha explains. Adrian, do you want... go ahead, Robert. No, go ahead.
God gave us 613 mitzvot, consisting of 365 prohibitions and 248 positive commandments. But this plurality is from the side of the recipient. From the side of the giver, blessed be he, they are all as a single precept. That is why it says, when we heard only the first 2 commandments, I am, and you shall not have, from the mouth of the Almighty, and the other 611 through Moshe. This is also why it says in the Midrash that God spoke all 10 commandments as a single utterance. For God is one and his commandments are one. From his side, there is no plurality. In the declaration I am, which expresses the singular existence of God, and its counterpart, he shall not have, which is the principle that one must not attribute to any plurality to him, are included all prohibitions and positive commandments. However, this is impossible for a human being to articulate, since, as a physical and time-bound being, man receives this singular truth in the form of a multiplicity of precepts.
Yeah, love it. Okay, so again, some of this might be a little bit hard for our brains to digest a little bit, but I still just wanted to kind of put it all out there. Adrian, do you want to read text number 10 for us?
The Rebbe expands on this theme, demonstrating how both the inclusiveness and the particularity of Torah are integral to its role in uniting creation with its creator. The divine reality is singular, whereas we inhabit a reality that is characterized by multiplicity and diversity. Torah, however, embraces both realities. That is why God communicated the Torah to us in both forms. First, he spoke the entirety of Torah as a single utterance, and then he recommunicated it to us in the form of multiple laws, precepts, and teachings. For in truth, one might ask, since God in any case repeated his communication at Sinai as 10 distinct precepts, what was the purpose of initially speaking them as a single utterance? But God desired that we should relate to and implement the Torah, not only in our human terms, but also in his terms. Excuse me. He desired that through Torah we should connect to and reveal within creation the divine singularity that transcends the bifurcations and fragmentations of a physical existence defined by the particularizations of time and space. For this purpose, even a most inclusive communication of Torah as the two precepts, I am your God and you shall have no other gods before me, would not suffice. Rather, at Sinai, we were given the Torah as a single utterance, within which even the most fundamental plurality of them all, the difference between yes and no, exists as a singular truth.
Thank you. All right, now we're up to part 4, which is the last section of this class and this topic. Okay, 2 aspects of the mitzvah, divine decree and refining deed. Okay, and I think this is also like really fascinating. Okay, so mitzvah means commandment. So wherever the Torah contains an instruction from God to us, right? Remember, like this is the commandment for Shabbos, remember the day of Shabbos to sanctify it, or the commandment of tefillin, you shall bind them as a sign upon your arm and they shall be as phylacteries between your eyes, or open your hand to your brethren, to your poor. Any of these, wherever there's an instruction from God, is a mitzvah, right? And the sages identify 613 mitzvot in the text of the written Torah. And where do we know all the details and particulars? In the oral Torah. And then in Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalists and Hasidic masters, we learn that mitzvah does not just mean commandments, right? And every time I teach this about mitzvah girls, I teach this also, like the literal, like the again, surface level, like main translation we use is commandment, but mitzvah means bond and connection. Savta, the chibur, a bond and a connection, because every single mitzvah that we do connects us to our Creator. Okay, so it's kind of like, and I think this analogy is given by one of the rabbis, like if there was like this, really brilliant scientist and a little 5-year-old child, you could say like, well, what does this brilliant scientist have to do with this little 5-year-old child? Like he's not, he's not in his lecture hall, he's not in, like they just have nothing in common. But as soon as like the brilliant scientist says to this little child, do you mind getting me a glass of water? And the little child runs, right? Now there's like a connection between them. There's like some connection made by just the simple request of like, can you do this thing, right? So in other words, a request that we make of someone else creates relationship. It creates a connection between the two. And that's just like an analogy for this idea where like us as limited human beings, like, and if you think about like the infinity of God and the fact that like we cannot, like godliness and our limited human brains, it's like so technically so far apart, and yet that's not what God wants. God wants a relationship with us. And so God specifically gives us mitzvot to say, this is how we're going to connect. This is how I'm going to like let you into my innermost, mind and ideas and desires, and I'm going to have a connection with these human beings that I've created. Okay. So, so we have these 2 perspectives on a mitzvah, right? The first perspective is that the most significant thing about a mitzvah is that the person fulfilling it, or the person performing it, is fulfilling a divine commandment, right? And if you look at it in that light, then the content and the nature of the act are of secondary significance. In other words, it almost doesn't even matter anymore what you're doing. You're just fulfilling a divine commandment, right? The scientist, that's the 5-year-old kid, like, it doesn't matter if it's like, can you get me a glass of water? Or like, can you do 10 jumping jacks? Or it doesn't even matter anymore. At that point, it's not about what they're doing. It's just the fact that whatever, it's like a request and a fulfillment and creating a relationship. Okay. So God, right? God is infinite, and the human being and anything he or she does or achieves is finite, right? So if the act of a mitzvah makes a connection between our Creator and the person who fulfills it, then it has nothing to do what the action about, like the significance of the action, but just the fact that God desired it. Right? So in the words of the Alter Rebbe, he says, had we been commanded by God to chop wood, in other words, meaning an act devoid of any spiritual utility, it would be no less a fulfillment of a divine desire than the most meaningful and enlightening deed. And I think that this perspective, and again, we're going to go to the other one, but this perspective is very important to keep in mind, because a lot of times we think like, well, I don't feel spiritual when I do this thing, right? And we think that like, that's the ultimate. The ultimate is I should feel connected. I should feel spiritual. And that is a beautiful thing. But even if we don't feel spiritual, the mitzvah is still the mitzvah. And we wouldn't use it as a reason to not do the mitzvah because I don't feel spiritual, right? And I say this always, like listening to the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is the mitzvah of the day. And so you could sit there and have tons of, kavana and spiritual feelings about the blast of the shofar and the wake-up call and the crowning God as king and all of that, and it could be an incredible experience. Or you could have none of those thoughts and just be like, I'm listening to a ram's horn, right? But it doesn't actually matter. Not that it doesn't matter. I mean, like, it doesn't mean that, all the beautiful kavana and meaning has worth to it, but you're fulfilling the mitzvah regardless. Whereas if someone's like, well, it's a month later and I'm going to listen to the shofar to fulfill the mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah, it actually accomplishes nothing. It's not Rosh Hashanah. Like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how, spiritually uplifted you feel when you're listening to the shofar. There's no mitzvah there, right? Or the opposite, just doing something where someone's like, I'm just going to, I don't know. I don't need to hear the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. I'm just going to go into my own backyard and have my own reflection or whatever. It's a beautiful thing, but that's not the mitzvah, right? So this idea here where it's actually not about how we feel when we're doing it or how spiritual we think the act is. It could be such a mundane act, right? But the fact that it's a commandment from God means already that by us fulfilling it, we are connecting with our Creator, okay? And from that perspective, there's no difference between mitzvot, right? One mitzvah could have tremendous sacrifice and take tons of years, a spiritual preparation to fulfill, right? Like, if we do it from that, one mitzvah could be really, really, really challenging for us. And another mitzvah could be effortless or just, it could be so simple, but no human accomplishment can be said to be more significant in relation to God than any other. So what is significant is the fact that this action was commanded by God, deemed by him to constitute the fulfillment of his will, a quality which every mitzvah shares equally, right? From this perspective, it doesn't matter if it's hard for you or easier for you, if it takes a second or if it takes a month, right? It's all the same. So, and as we know also from Ethics of Our Fathers in Pirkei Avot, it says, text 11, be as diligent with a minor mitzvah as with a major one, as you cannot know the rewards of the mitzvah. Like, we don't know. Like, we might think that, oh, this little simple mitzvah is not as important, I'm going to do this big other thing, but really we don't know. And it also says in Tanchuma, do not sit and weigh the commandments of the Torah. Like, it's not for us to judge what is more important and less important. The Talmud also says that this is also the basis of the halachic rule that one who is occupied with doing a mitzvah is absolved from a different mitzvah. So, for example, one who is caring for a sick person during the festival of Sukkot is not obligated to eat in the sukkah. Of course, that, it's a little simplified there. There's details to even that concept, but the idea that, like, if you're in the middle of one mitzvah, another mitzvah, for example, here's where this might apply in a very practical level, is like, well, not really. I was going to say that, like, if a brit, milah, if a circumcision falls out on Shabbat, right, that supersedes Shabbat. That's a little bit different. That's about what supersedes. But it's like, it's more important for the brit to be done than for the concept of Shabbat in that moment. But I don't think that was the right analogy for that. But okay, because all mitzvot share a singular essence, right? They're all the fulfillment of the divine will. And you don't have to interrupt one for the other, because there's not this idea of like one being greater than the other. You're already connecting to God. But then, so that's perspective number one. Then there's another perspective on the mitzvah. The mitzvah as tools for perfection and refinement of human life, okay? Like we say in Tehillim, text 14, it is written, God, his way is perfect. The word of God is refined. And on this, Rav says, the mitzvot were given in order to refine the human being. For what does God care if one slaughters an animal from the throat or one slaughters from the nape? Like, who cares where it's slaughtered? But the mitzvot were given to refine the human being. Okay? So from this perspective, there are differences. In fact, none of them are the same, right? We're very multifaceted. There's a lot, when it comes to human growth, the spectrum is huge. We have positive traits that have to be developed. We have negative traits that we want to conquer, right? We have our spiritual self, our material self, our intellectual self, our emotional self, the family life, social, financial, political, right? Like we as humans are multifaceted people, and everything we do is also influenced by our environment and the things that we're in. And so any program whose purpose is to refine the human being, right, then it has to address itself to each of these individual components of human life, right? It's like vast then what each person even needs to be refined. So therefore, the mitzvot, there's positive mitzvot in the Torah and negative, right? There's mitzvot involving thought, feeling, speech, action, diet, dress, intimacy, agriculture, home construction. Like literally there is Torah to govern every part of our lives. There's a way that we put on our shoes, Okay, a way we get dressed in the morning. It's like there is literally Torah for, like, that's what I mean when I say that, like, Torah is 99.9% in the home, because it's literally your daily life. It's the every actions that we take. It's not like it's like how we dress, how we eat, how we behave, how we think, because it's about self-refinement, and Torah is going to be like the curriculum for that. Okay. Harriet just asked, what was the book your daughter read that was so impactful on her? Ooh, I'd have to look at the title. We have a subscription to a Jewish library that's based in New York. And they do this actually for shluchim, because shluchim around the world, right, who are in all these remote places, or I don't know if I call Nevada remote, but we don't have access to a Jewish library. And so we have a subscription where you could order 10 books and they mail it to you, and then she reads them, we mail it back, we order another 10 books. So she has access to this beautiful library of Jewish books, and just my preference on the Jewish books is because she's automatically reading things that have a lot of teichen is the Hebrew word, like content and substance and lessons, right? Because that's the idea here. Anyways, okay. Naomi, I like how you explain about mitzvot not needing to be heartfelt when we perform them, that it's about connecting with God by doing what God wants us to do. I want to focus more on that idea. Okay, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so now we know if it's like we have a mitzvah that literally involves every part of our life. Different mitzvot for different days of the year, different times of the year. Like it's so vast, right? 613 mitzvot, like we said, 248 positive, 365 prohibitions corresponding to the 248 organs and limbs of the human body, and 365 veins and sinews. So on that level, from this perspective, the second perspective, then there are major mitzvot and minor mitzvot, right? Just like we have a major and minor organs in our body, our heart or our brain. You can't really compare that to like our appendix that could be taken out or something like that, right? And we have major and minor components to our human life, and the mitzvot are there to transform us and to refine us and to help us. Okay, so text 16, Rabbi Hanania ben Akashia said, God wanted to give merit to the people of Israel, therefore he multiplied for them Torah and mitzvot. As it is written, God desired for the sake of his righteousness, he will make Torah greater and more powerful. In other words, almost like, why is there so much multiplicity? Why are there 613 mitzvot, right? That's what like this mission is saying. Why does there have to be so many? And every mitzvah and every concept in Torah, and they're all like different from each other, and sometimes even could seem contradictory, could seem opposite, right? Sometimes we're like, Torah study is the best thing, and then other times it says like mitzvot are the best thing, and the deed is the best thing, and then the learning is the best thing. Like it's just like sometimes it seems like, well, which one, right? But it could also be in that moment what is the most important, right? So there's there's this general distinction between positive and negative. We also know that there's like the three categories, mishpatim, edot, and chukim, right? There's the laws that are like civil statutes, civil laws that we would probably all come up with on our own. And then there's laws that are super rational that we can't understand necessarily. They're above human logic and understanding. And then there's the mitzvot that we do as a testimony for something, like we keep, like to remember something, we keep Shabbat, we keep Passover, these are remembrances, right? So there's this idea, right? And again, like we said before, that Torah study all has its own, all these different levels of meaning and all of that, but Torah and mitzvah were given by one God, and their purpose is to draw down and reveal the truth, that God is one, his name is one, right? So we're talking about singularity here. So obviously, our service of God should be permeated with this objective. Every mitzvah we do should express the singular goal of achieving the union of the observer of the mitzvah with the absolute singularity of God. Like if I was going to just boil this down to one thing, right? Every mitzvah, it's just like me and God and achieving the purpose of why I'm here and a union with my creator. Same thing with our Torah study. Its purpose is that through studying and comprehending the divine wisdom, we unite with the giver of the Torah. And then we get to this question, if the purpose and function of Torah and mitzvot is unity, why are they themselves of such a multiplicious and diverse format? Do you have it on the screen for you, Maddie? Are you able to see? Do you want to read that for us?
Yes. The answer, says the Rebbe, lies in the opening words of the Mishnah. God wanted to give merit to the people of Israel. The Hebrew word used here for to give merit, lizakot, also means to refine. God wanted to refine the people of Israel, the Mishnah is saying. Therefore, he multiplied for them Torah and mitzvot. Indeed, the Rebbe goes on to explain the function of the Torah and mitzvot is to unite us and the world in which we live with God. However, there are two distinct ways in which this union is achieved. The first is through abnegation, bitul, and the second through refinement, zichuch. Abnegation, because the cardinal truth of reality is that there is none else besides him, that God is one and only reality. Everything else is but the manifestation of God's desire that it be. Hence, the truth that God is one and his name is one. God is the one and only reality, as the entirety of creation is his one name, his singular self-expression. The fragmented and multiplicious reality we experience is a concealment and distortion of this truth. Torah and mitzvot are the means by which we dissolve this concealment and reveal the divine singularity. When the human mind is transformed into a receptacle of divine wisdom, when human life is remade as an exercise in the fulfillment of the divine will, we become one with God. In this sense, studying Torah is an act of abnegation, as the human mind and intellect become an empty vessel to receive the divine wisdom. Performing a mitzvah is an act of abnegation, as the manifold desires and aspirations which constitute the human self give way to the singular goal of fulfilling the divine desire.
Okay, so now we come to this question. Let's see. Barbara, do you want to read that for us?
Sure. Question, would this objective not be better served if the whole of Torah consisted of one great idea and one great mitzvah, which we would devote our entire being to mastering and fulfilling? In truth, the whole of Torah is one idea. All mitzvot are, in essence, a single mitzvah, but this is its deeper underlying truth. On the surface, Torah is comprised of myriads of ideas, each with myriad levels of understanding corresponding to the multiple forms that the human intellect assumes and the multiple pathways it follows. And it has 613 mitzvot, corresponding to every aspect of our existence. Question, why is the Torah conforming to the very concealment and distortion it comes to debunk? This is where the second method of unification comes in. Torah and its commandments unite us with God, not only by abnegating the multiplicity of the created reality, but also by refining it. With the abnegation approach, human nature is made to naught and thus unites with its creator. With the refinement approach, we retain our natural characteristics, yet these self-same characteristics are refined and created through our study of Torah and our fulfillment of mitzvot. The divine unity is revealed not because of the multiplicity of the created state has been dissolved, but rather because that self-same multiplicity has become saturated with and perfected by the divine wisdom and will. Otherwise stated, with both approaches, Torah and mitzvot unite us with God. But with the abnegation approach, this unity is achieved on God's terms, so to speak. We surrender all that makes us what we are in order to allow his reality to permeate our beings. With the refinement approach, the unity is achieved on our terms. Our own multiplicitous existence is enhanced and perfected through its study of Torah and its fulfillment of the mitzvot. Oh, wow.
Thank you. I know. So who wants to, who wants to like give us just the summary, like the bottom line, here's the biggest takeaway from all of this. Go for it, Barbara. Let's hear what you have to say.
Well, we exist on a diversity level. We live on earth and we have I and thou. It's not really so because all is one. But in order for us to function, God has given us all these mitzvot for us to accomplish and thus refine our beings.
I love that. Thank you. Anyone else want to add anything?
I just want to say this class has been a eureka experience.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell me.
Thank you so much. Well, I just never thought of it before in terms of the particular and unification.
Mm-hmm.
That is like a revelation.
Love it. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I love it too. Thank you.
Does anyone have, anyone like is welcome to share any comments? And also like what Tessa gave me, like 2 very practical questions. If you have any questions that I might be able to answer or I might not, and then I'll research it and I'll just send out one more like kind of follow-up email with like real solid answers to those. So if you have any questions or comments, you're
Well,
welcome to chime in.
this is Harriet. I think the idea that you do the mitzvah because you are uniting with God.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reason you do the mitzvah.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't get the spiritual idea of it, that doesn't matter. You do the mitzvah. And hopefully that you'll get the spiritual, but it's the action is more important than, you don't, I guess you don't wait until you have extra money to give. You give whatever you have.
Yeah.
And I think that's the main thing that I'm getting out of today's was the mitzvah. And I'm looking forward to learning more about the positive mitzvahs. And when my kids were little, I was focusing on at one point because it was like Jews don't do these things, and I kept saying Judaism should be a positive experience. So bring the positive in. What do we do for positive things?
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's what I'm getting out of this one. And thank you. And I have to go pick up a book at the library, so
All
I'm
right.
gonna have to say goodbye.
Go.
Bye.
Bye, Harriet. All right. Anybody else? So should we end here? And I will just say I've really enjoyed all of these Torah and Tea classes, and I look forward to when we start up again. I will let you know when that is. And if you have any specific requests for topics, I know I got one today from Naomi and Adrian, you can send them my way so that we see where we continue. And it was just wonderful learning with all of you.
Thank you.
Have a great summer.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Have a great summer.